Samantha stared out the passenger window, watching the dense forest swallow the narrow dirt road as Greg navigated their car deeper into the woods. A canopy of trees loomed overhead, their branches tangled like claws, casting long, shifting shadows on the ground. They hadn't seen another car or person for miles, not since they turned off the main road. The GPS had lost signal a while back, and they were relying on the vague directions the Airbnb host had emailed a few days earlier. "This better be worth it," Samantha muttered, more to herself than to Greg. She couldn't help but feel a gnawing anxiety as they pushed farther into isolation. What was supposed to be a peaceful, romantic getaway now felt like the beginning of something far more unsettling. "Hey, we're almost there," Greg replied, his voice upbeat but tinged with an undercurrent of nervousness. "A little digital detox, remember? No work, no stress. Just us and nature. This is going to be great." Samantha forced a smile. She wanted to believe him. They both needed this. Time away from the city, away from their jobs, and the growing tension that had been creeping into their relationship. It had been Greg's idea to book the cottage, an isolated retreat in the heart of the forest, advertised as a place to disconnect and unwind. The photos on the listing had looked charming, a small rustic house, its white wooden exterior glowing under the afternoon sun, surrounded by tall trees and endless greenery. But now, under the dim light of dusk, the reality of the place felt much different. The road narrowed further, the car jostling over bumps and stones. Samantha gripped the door handle, a sense of dread creeping up her spine. The forest seemed endless, the trees closing in on them from all sides. Then, finally, the cottage came into view. It sat at the end of the road, half hidden behind overgrown bushes and wild ivy. The white paint was chipped and faded, the wooden boards worn and slightly warped from years of exposure to the elements. The windows were dark, reflecting nothing but the surrounding trees. The once charming house now looked weathered and desolate, standing like a forgotten relic of another time. "This is it," Greg said, pulling the car to a stop in front of the small gravel driveway. He tried to sound excited, but Samantha could hear the uncertainty in his voice. He glanced over at her, offering a reassuring smile. "It looks cozy, right?" Samantha didn't respond immediately. She stared at the cottage, trying to shake the unsettling feeling that had settled in her chest. There was something off about the place, something she couldn't quite put her finger on. But she didn't want to ruin the trip before it even started. She knew Greg had gone through a lot of trouble to plan this weekend, and the last thing she wanted was to seem ungrateful. "Yeah," she said finally, forcing a grin. "Cozy." They stepped out of the car into the cool evening air. The forest around them was silent, unnervingly so. There were no birds, no rustling of animals in the underbrush, only the soft whisper of the wind moving through the trees, carrying with it the scent of damp earth and decaying leaves. Greg grabbed their bags from the trunk and headed toward the front porch. The wooden steps creaked under his weight as he walked up to the door. Samantha hesitated for a moment before following him. She couldn't shake the feeling that they weren't alone, that the trees were watching, waiting. The door groaned as Greg pushed it open, revealing the interior of the cottage. The air inside was cold and stale, as if the place hadn't been aired out in years. The living room was small, with old wooden floors that creaked under their feet, and furniture that looked like it had been there for decades. A stone fireplace stood against one wall, its hearth blackened with soot. The walls were lined with dark wood paneling, giving the room a gloomy, oppressive feel. "It just needs a little warming up," Greg said, setting their bags down and rubbing his hands together. "I'll get a fire going." Samantha nodded absently, her eyes scanning the room. There was an odd sense of stillness here, like the house had been suspended in time. Everything was too quiet, too still, as if the air itself was waiting for something to happen. She couldn't shake the feeling of being watched, a prickling sensation on the back of her neck that made her skin crawl. She wandered toward the staircase at the far end of the room, glancing up at the second floor. The steps were narrow and steep, disappearing into the shadows above. A sense of unease washed over her as she stared into the darkness at the top of the stairs. For a brief moment, she thought she saw something, just a flicker of movement. But when she blinked, it was gone. "Sam?" Greg's voice snapped her out of her thoughts. She turned to see him standing by the fireplace, a small fire crackling to life in the hearth. He was smiling at her, trying to lighten the mood. "Come sit with me. Let's relax for a bit." Samantha nodded, but the unease still lingered as she walked over to the couch and sat down beside him. The firelight flickered across the room, casting long, distorted shadows on the walls. Outside, the wind picked up, rattling the windows in their frames. For a while, they sat in silence, the only sound the crackling of the fire and the occasional creak of the house as it settled. But the silence was far from peaceful. It was thick with tension, like the calm before a storm. As the light outside faded into complete darkness, Samantha's unease grew stronger. She glanced at the window, her breath catching in her throat. For a moment, she thought she saw something, a figure standing just beyond the tree line, watching them from the shadows. But when she blinked, it was gone. Just her imagination, she told herself. Just a trick of the light. But deep down, she knew better. Something wasn't right about this place. Something was waiting for them in the dark, and whatever it was, it had been waiting for a long time. The night had only just begun. The fire in the hearth crackled, casting warm light across the small living room, but it did little to chase away the unease that had settled over Samantha. She sat huddled in an old armchair, nursing a glass of wine that had long gone warm. Greg was on the couch across from her, already half asleep with his head tilted back and his eyes closed, his chest rising and falling in a slow, steady rhythm. But Samantha couldn't relax, not with the strange, oppressive silence pressing in around them. Outside, the wind whistled through the trees, rattling the old windows of the cottage, but beyond that, there was nothing. No sounds of animals, no chirping crickets or rustling leaves. The forest surrounding the house felt dead, as if something had chased all life away, leaving only the cold emptiness in its wake. She glanced at Greg, envying his ability to sleep so easily. He had always been the logical one, the one who could rationalize anything away. But Samantha had always been more sensitive to the subtle things, the things that hid just beneath the surface of the ordinary, waiting for the right moment to reveal themselves. And right now, every instinct in her body was telling her that something was wrong. The house creaked again, a deep groan that reverberated through the walls, and Samantha stiffened in her chair. Her eyes flicked to the ceiling, listening intently. It could have been just the house settling. Old houses made noises after all. But this sound was different. It was deliberate, heavy, as if something was shifting above them. Greg stirred on the couch, blinking sleepily. "You okay, Sam?" His voice was soft, groggy, as he sat up and rubbed his eyes. She forced a smile, trying to keep her voice steady. "Yeah, I'm fine. I thought I heard something upstairs." Greg chuckled, his smile lazy but reassuring. "This place is old. It's probably just the wind or the house creaking. Try to relax." Samantha wanted to believe him, to write off the noise as nothing more than her imagination playing tricks on her. But the feeling of being watched persisted, like invisible eyes were tracking her every move. She shivered and pulled the blanket tighter around herself, trying to shake the sensation. Another creak, this time closer, directly above them. She jolted in her seat and Greg raised an eyebrow. "Did you hear that?" she whispered. Greg sighed, getting to his feet and stretching. "I'll go check it out. It's probably just some loose floorboards or a draft." "No, wait," Samantha protested, but Greg was already making his way to the stairs, grabbing the flashlight from the coffee table as he went. She stood, her heart pounding in her chest as she followed him to the base of the narrow staircase. The stairs groaned under Greg's weight as he ascended slowly, the beam of the flashlight cutting through the darkness. Samantha hesitated at the bottom, her eyes fixed on the top of the stairs, where the hallway disappeared into shadow. The air felt colder up there, and the sense of unease grew with every step Greg took. "See?" Greg called down after a moment. "Nothing. Just a bunch of old wood and—" He paused, the light from the flashlight flickering as it swept across the landing. "What?" Samantha asked, her voice tight with anxiety. "What is it?" Greg didn't answer right away. He moved the flashlight back to where it had flickered earlier, shining the light on something just out of sight. Samantha's skin prickled with dread as she strained to see what he was looking at. Finally, Greg sighed and shook his head. "It's just a draft," he said, though his voice had lost some of its confidence. He took a step back toward the stairs. "The windows up here must not be sealed properly. We'll have to tell the host to fix it." Samantha didn't move. She kept staring up at the darkness beyond the beam of the flashlight. Something felt off. Greg was trying to sound nonchalant, but she could hear the tension in his voice, the uncertainty he was trying to hide. "Let's just go back downstairs," he suggested, heading down the steps. Samantha nodded, relieved that he wasn't going to push the issue. But as they returned to the living room, her sense of dread didn't fade. If anything, it grew stronger, gnawing at the edges of her mind. They sat back down by the fire, the warmth of the flames doing little to ease the chill that had settled into Samantha's bones. She could still hear the faint creaks and groans of the house above them, almost like footsteps pacing back and forth across the floor. Every time she thought they stopped, they would start up again, slow and methodical, like something or someone was moving through the rooms upstairs. Greg tried to make small talk, but Samantha's attention was elsewhere, her mind focused entirely on the sounds. She couldn't shake the feeling that there was something up there, something they couldn't see but that was very much aware of them. Suddenly, there was a loud crash from above. Both Samantha and Greg jumped to their feet, staring at the ceiling in shock. The sound had been loud, unmistakable, like something heavy had fallen or been thrown across the floor. "What the hell was that?" Greg muttered, his earlier confidence completely shattered. Samantha's heart raced in her chest. "I told you," she whispered. "There's something up there." Greg grabbed the flashlight again, but this time his hands were shaking. He glanced at Samantha, his face pale. "Stay down here. I'll check it out." "No way," she said firmly, her voice trembling. "I'm not staying down here alone." Together they ascended the stairs, each step feeling heavier than the last. The hallway at the top of the stairs was eerily quiet, the air thick with a palpable sense of unease. Greg held the flashlight out in front of him, the beam cutting through the darkness as they moved cautiously down the hallway. They reached the master bedroom where the crash had come from. Greg pushed the door open slowly, and Samantha held her breath, her heart pounding in her chest. The room was empty. The bed was still made, the furniture untouched. But then Greg shone the flashlight toward the far corner of the room, and Samantha felt her blood run cold. The old wooden rocking chair that had been in the corner earlier was now overturned, lying on its side as if it had been thrown with force. Greg stared at it in disbelief. That wasn't like that before, was it? Samantha shook her head, her throat tight with fear. Number, it wasn't. They stood in silence for a moment, the weight of the situation settling over them. Something had moved the chair, something that wasn't them. Samantha's mind raced, trying to make sense of it all, but there was no rational explanation. The cottage was isolated. There was no one else around for miles, and yet it felt like they weren't alone. Not at all. "We should leave," Samantha whispered, her voice trembling. "Something's not right here." Greg swallowed hard, his face pale as he nodded. "Yeah, maybe you're right." As they turned to leave the room, Samantha glanced back at the overturned chair one last time. The air felt colder now, heavier, as if something unseen was watching them from the shadows. She couldn't shake the feeling that whatever had knocked over the chair wasn't finished with them yet. As they descended the stairs and returned to the living room, Samantha's heart pounded in her chest. The unsettling night wasn't over, not by a long shot. And deep down, she knew the worst was yet to come. Samantha's eyes flew open. She wasn't sure what had woken her. A sound, a shift in the air, but her skin prickled with a bone-deep dread. Her heart hammered in her chest as her eyes darted around the dark room, her breath caught in her throat. Beside her, Greg lay still, his breathing slow and even. The fire in the hearth had long since died, leaving only faint embers that glowed weakly, casting flickering shadows across the walls. For a moment, Samantha lay there, completely frozen. She strained to hear any sound, any creak of the old cottage, but the silence was suffocating, heavier than it had ever been before. It felt like the entire world had gone still, waiting. She swallowed hard and shifted slightly, the bedsheets rustling softly as she propped herself up on one elbow. Her eyes moved to the door of the bedroom. It was still slightly ajar, just as they had left it before finally crawling into bed earlier. But something was wrong. She couldn't quite put her finger on it, but the air felt different. Then she heard it. A soft shuffling sound coming from the hallway outside the room. It was subtle, almost imperceptible, but unmistakable. Someone or something was moving out there. Samantha's pulse quickened and she glanced at Greg. He was still fast asleep, oblivious to the creeping danger that seemed to be drawing closer. She felt paralyzed by indecision. Every instinct told her to wake him, to run, to do anything but lie there and wait for whatever was out there to find them. But she couldn't move. It was as though the house itself was holding her in place, keeping her pinned to the bed as the darkness pressed in closer. Another shuffle. This time it was louder, closer. Samantha's breath hitched as her gaze locked on the narrow sliver of hallway visible through the gap in the door. The shadows seemed to shift and twist there, as if something was moving just beyond her sight, lurking in the inky blackness. A soft creak echoed through the stillness, a single deliberate step taken just outside the bedroom door. Samantha's blood ran cold. She knew, without a doubt, that something was standing there, watching, waiting. Slowly, with every nerve in her body screaming in protest, she reached out and gently nudged Greg's shoulder. "Greg," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "Wake up." Greg stirred, groaning softly as he blinked his eyes open. "What?" he mumbled, still half asleep. "Shh," Samantha hissed, her voice shaking. "Listen." Greg sat up, his grogginess quickly giving way to confusion as he followed her gaze toward the door. The sound of breathing, deep, slow breaths, began to fill the room. But it wasn't their own. It came from just beyond the threshold, from whatever stood in the shadows outside their door. Greg froze, his eyes wide with realization. His hand instinctively reached for the flashlight on the nightstand, but Samantha grabbed his arm, stopping him. "Don't," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "It'll see us." Greg nodded slowly, his expression tense with fear. They sat there in the darkness, hearts pounding as the breathing grew louder, heavier. It was as though something was standing just beyond the door, its face inches from the crack, watching them with unseen eyes. And then, ever so slowly, the door began to creak open. Samantha held her breath, her stomach twisting in terror as the door swung inward, revealing more of the shadowy hallway beyond. But there was nothing there. No figure, no intruder. Just the dark, empty hallway. The breathing stopped. For a moment, everything was still, the silence stretching on interminably. Samantha let out a shaky breath, her body trembling with relief. Maybe it had gone. Maybe whatever had been there had decided to leave them alone. But then something moved. It wasn't in the hallway anymore. It was in the room with them. The shadows in the corner of the room seemed to shift and warp, bending and twisting into something solid, something human. Samantha's eyes widened in horror as a figure began to take shape, stepping out from the darkness as if it had been hiding there all along. It was a man, or at least it had once been. His face was pale, gaunt, his eyes sunken deep into his skull. He wore an old-fashioned suit, frayed and tattered at the edges, his skin gray and translucent, as though he had been pulled from the depths of the earth. But what struck Samantha most was his eyes, cold, lifeless, and yet filled with a terrifying hunger. The man took a step toward them, his movements slow, deliberate. His lips twisted into a grotesque smile, revealing sharp, jagged teeth that gleamed in the faint light of the dying embers. Samantha tried to scream, but no sound came out. Her throat had closed up, her body frozen in place. Beside her, Greg was paralyzed with fear, his eyes locked on the figure as it drew closer, its gaze never leaving theirs. The man's voice, when he spoke, was a low, rasping whisper that sent shivers down Samantha's spine. "You shouldn't have come here," he said, his voice dripping with malice. "This place, it's mine." Samantha's mind raced, searching for a way out, for anything that could save them. But there was nothing. They were trapped, cornered by something far beyond their understanding. The man took another step closer, his cold, dead eyes fixed on Samantha. She squeezed her eyes shut, bracing herself for the inevitable. But then, a loud crash erupted from downstairs, followed by the unmistakable sound of breaking glass. The man froze, his head snapping toward the doorway. For a brief, terrifying moment, the air was thick with tension as the intruder's focus shifted from them to whatever had made the sound below. Without a word, the man melted back into the shadows, disappearing as suddenly as he had appeared. The room was empty once more, save for the faint echo of his breathing that lingered in the air. Samantha exhaled shakily, her body trembling with adrenaline and fear. She looked over at Greg, who was pale and wide-eyed, his chest rising and falling with quick, shallow breaths. Neither of them spoke. They were both too shaken, too overwhelmed by what had just happened. But they couldn't stay here, not anymore. "We have to leave," Samantha whispered, her voice hoarse. Greg nodded, his movements jerky as he grabbed his shoes and coat from the floor. Samantha did the same, her hands shaking as she pulled on her jacket. The air in the cottage felt thick with an oppressive energy, as though the walls themselves were watching them, urging them to leave. They crept downstairs, every creak of the old wooden floorboards sending chills down Samantha's spine. The front door was hanging open, the night air seeping into the house, cold and sharp. Beyond it, the forest loomed like a wall of shadows, silent and foreboding. Greg hesitated at the threshold, glancing back at the house. "What the hell was that?" he whispered, his voice laced with fear. Samantha shook her head, her mind still reeling. "I don't know," she said softly, "but whatever it was, it wanted us gone." Without another word, they stepped out into the night, leaving the cottage behind them. The cold air bit at their skin as they made their way to the car, their footsteps quick and hurried. As they pulled away, Samantha glanced back at the cottage one last time. The house was dark and still, its windows like empty eyes watching them go. But standing on the porch, barely visible in the shadows, was the figure of the man, his hollow eyes gleaming faintly in the darkness as he watched them leave. Samantha shuddered and turned her gaze forward, gripping the steering wheel tightly. They were leaving the cottage behind, but deep down she knew the truth. Whatever had been there, whatever had claimed that house as its own, had not been left behind. It had followed them. And as they drove away, disappearing into the dark, winding roads of the forest, Samantha couldn't shake the feeling that they would never truly escape. Not from him.